Hello, History 101, and welcome to Phoner's 6th edition Give Me Liberty, Chapter 11th. This week we're going to be discussing slavery, the peculiar institution, starting with Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in 1818. Douglass represented the age of the self-made man, and his rise to distinction from his humble origins and his contributions to abolition and the meaning of Black freedom. He was the son of a slave mother and an unknown white father, but he violated Maryland law by learning to read and write and experienced slavery in all its variety, including bondage as a house servant, skilled shipyard craftsman, and plantation field hand. Sent to the slave breaker to curb his spirit, he defiantly refused to be broken, and the experience intensified his desire for freedom. Using the borrowed free papers of a black sailor, he escaped north and became the most influential African American and advocate for racial equality in the 19th century. He lectured against slavery in the North and in Britain, edited anti slavery publications, published a widely read autobiographical condemnation of slavery, and testified to the incorrectness of prevailing ideas of black inferiority. He was also active in other reform movements, such as women's rights, advised Lincoln on black soldiers' employment, and was an early advocate for the right to vote. He died in 1895 at the dawn of a new system of white supremacy based on segregation and disenfranchisement. Throughout his career, he insisted that continuous resistance could eliminate slavery and that slaves' desire for freedom was truer to the nation's principle than white Americans who annually celebrated independence while allowing slavery to continue. This image of the Portuguese slave ship Diligent was painted by an officer on a British naval vessel in 1838. By this time, the Diligent's voyage with 600 slaves on board was illegal. The international agreement outlawing the Atlantic slave trade was largely enforced by British ships. Today, we're going to be discussing the Old South and how the peculiar institution became, well, peculiar. We're also going to be discussing the ways that slaves resisted this institution, including their own creation of culture and their methods of slave agency. Our first focus question: how did slavery shape the social and economic relations of the Old South? By 1820, slavery was an old institution in America. With abolition in the northern states, the peculiar institution of slavery became unique to the South. By the Civil War, the slave population had increased to nearly 4 million, and slavery had spread to Arkansas, Louisiana, and eastern Texas. Slaves were one-third of the South's entire population and half of the population in the cotton states of the Deep South. Slavery's expansion was due to growth of cotton production, which replaced sugar as the world's major slave crop. Though slavery persisted in Brazil and the Caribbean, Britain's abolition of slavery within its empire in 1833 made the United States slavery's new center in the hemisphere. The Old South was the largest and most powerful slave society in all of history, based on the region's virtual monopoly of cotton. Cotton's use in textile manufacturing made it central to the Industrial Revolution in Europe and America and the most important commodity in international trade. By 1860, investments in slaves exceeded in value the worth of all of the nation's factories, railroads, and banks combined. To replace the foreign slave trade that had been banned in the United States in 1808, a massive internal slave trade developed. More than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860, many of whom were transported to the Deep South to the new cotton plantations. Virtually every slaveholder at some point bought or sold slaves. The Cotton Kingdom could not have developed without the internal slave trade, and older slave states in the East came to depend on the sale of their slaves. This is a Texan farm in Montgomery County, a drawing from 1843 which depicts a cotton farm on the Texas frontier. The owner's house is at the center, flanked by slave cabins, and on the far right, a cotton gin and press. At this point, 2 years before its annexation by the United States, Texas was an independent republic. Although the northern states abolished slavery, slavery affected them nonetheless. The Constitution enhanced the power of the South in the House of Representatives and Electoral College, and required all states to return fugitives from bondage. Slavery touched the lives of all Americans. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and profited from it. Cotton trade profits helped finance industrial development and internal improvements in the North. Northern ships carried cotton, Northern banks financed plantations, Northern companies insured slave property, and Northern factories turned cotton into clothing. While slavery defined and dominated the South's economy, the South was a very diverse region. In the Upper South, slaves and slave owners were a much smaller percentage of the population compared to the Deep South states stretching from South Carolina to Texas. The Upper South had centers of manufacturing, while the Deep South depended entirely on cotton. Yet slavery caused the South to have a very different economic development from the North. Slavery inhibited industrial growth, discouraged immigration, and slowed the technological progress. It did not have large and diverse cities as in the North, except for New Orleans. Banks and railroad lines served plantations and little else. While many in the North thought slavery prevented economic growth, slavery was, in fact, very profitable and expanded the Southern economy. In this painting from 1842, slaves, men, women, and children, are accompanying an ox cart carrying the week's cotton crop to New Orleans. Rather than being evenly distributed throughout the South, the slave population was concentrated in areas with the most fertile soil and easiest access to national and international markets. By 1860, a significant percentage of the slave population had been transported from the Atlantic coast to the lower South via the internal slave trade. And this is a slave dealer's place of business in Alexandria, Virginia, then part of the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. The buying and selling of slaves was a regularized part of the Southern economy, and such businesses were a common sight in every Southern city. This building contained a slave pen that typically contained over 300 slaves being kept before their sale. This chart shows the growth of the slave population between the years 1790 and 1860. You can see how it trended generally upward. The majority of Southern white families owned no slaves. Because planters had the best land, most white small farmers lived outside the plantation belt in areas unsuitable for cotton. They worked the land with the labor of family members, not slaves or wage workers. Many were self sufficient and remote from the markets. They were often desperately poor and more often illiterate than Northern farmers, since most Southern states lacked free public schools. In part, because these farmers did not provide a market for manufactured goods, the South did not develop industry. While some poor whites resented the planters' economic and political power, most accommodated the planters and shared with them a common racial identity, business ties, common political culture, and kinship ties. Many white small farmers believed that their economic and personal freedom rested on slavery. Most slave owners did not own large plantations. In 1850, most slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer slaves. Only a small number of families owned more than 20 slaves, and even fewer owned more than 100 slaves. Planters' slave property provided wealth, status, and influence. They held the best land, had the highest incomes, and they dominated local and state politics and government. Small slave owners aspired to become large planters. Planters owned slaves to make huge profits, and they used those profits for conspicuous consumption of luxury goods, creating an aristocratic material life sharply at odds with life for most Northerners. This 1860 view of New Orleans captures the size and scale of the cotton trade in the South's largest city. More than 3,500 steamboats arrived in New Orleans in 1860 alone. And this shows slaveholding with broken down by how many slaves each family owned. And as you can tell, most families, 105,000, only owned between 2 and 4 slaves. Only 250 people in all of the South owned more than 200 slaves. And those are your large planter families. An upcountry family, here dressed in homespun in Cedar Mountain, Virginia. Many white families in pre-Civil War South were largely isolated from the market economy. This photograph was taken in 1862, but reflects the pre-war way of life. And this is Louisa, a slave woman, with her charge in an 1856 photograph. Louisa had been purchased at the age of 22 at a slave auction in New Orleans to serve as a nursemaid. But the death of the white family made the child in this picture her legal owner. Plantations were a part of the world market, and planters worked to accumulate land, slaves, and great profits, some of which they invested in railroads and banks. Planters did not celebrate competitive capitalism, but a hierarchical agrarian society in which slaveholding gentlemen took personal responsibility for the well being of their dependent women, children, and slaves. This outlook of paternalism had long been a feature of American slavery, but it deepened with the end of the African slave trade, which closed the cultural gap between slaves and owners. And most Southern slave owners lived on their own plantations, close to their slaves. Paternalism obscured and justified slavery's brutality. Owners thought themselves kind and responsible even while they bought, sold, and punished their slaves. Over time, Southern values diverged from the North's culture of egalitarianism, competition, and individualism. In the South, men of all classes followed a code of personal honor in which they were expected to defend the reputation of themselves and their families with violence if necessary. Dueling, while illegal, was not uncommon. Southern white women were even more confined to the home and the domestic ideal than Northern women. This detail from Norman's chart of the lower Mississippi River, 1858, shows slave plantations laid out so that each one fronted the river and therefore had easy access to the market. In the 30 years before the Civil War, pro-slavery thought came to dominate Southern intellectual and cultural life. Fewer Southern whites felt, as had many of the founding fathers, that slavery was a necessary evil, and more they began to argue that it was actually a positive good. Racism, the belief that blacks were innately inferior to whites and thus more suited for slavery, framed the pro-slavery argument. Slave owners also found justification for slavery in ancient history and the Bible. Some Southerners argued that black slavery guaranteed equality for whites by preventing the growth of a white working class in the South. Slavery, they argued, provided the economic autonomy and independence that the North's industrial workers lacked, and that formed the basis of the Republic. Southern slaveholders knew of the Haitian Revolution and other slave rebellions, as well as British abolition. Emancipation throughout the Americas strongly shaped debates about slavery and its future in the United States. While American slave owners argued that emancipation had been a failure, abolitionists disagreed. By 1850, slave systems remained in the Western Hemisphere only in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. Nonetheless, the massive growth of the slave population of the Old South meant that there were more slaves in the hemisphere in 1860 than any other point in time. Most Southern slaveholders owned fewer than 5 slaves. The largest plantations were concentrated in the coastal South Carolina and along the Mississippi River. And this pre-Civil War engraving depicts the paternalist ideal. The old slave in the foreground says, "God bless you, massa. You feed and you clothe us, and when we too old to work, you provide for us." The master replies, "These poor creatures are a sacred legacy from my ancestors, and while a dollar is left to me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness." Many white Southerners claimed that they were the true inheritors of the Revolution's legacy, and that they freely used the language of liberty to compare their condition to slavery. They complained that government interference with their economy threatened to enslave them. Southern state constitutions acknowledged equal rights for free white men, but in the 1830s, some pro-slavery writers began to argue that liberty, equality, and democracy were not necessarily beneficial to the South. South Carolina, in particular, was home to many who argued that freedom and equality were not universal entitlements, even for all whites. When sectionalism intensified after 1830, more Southern writers and politicians came to defend slavery not as ensuring equality between whites, but as the basis of an organic hierarchical society in which white large planters ruled over lesser whites and slaves. George Fitzhugh, a Virginian, took this argument to the extreme, repudiating Jeffersonian ideals and the idea of America's world mission to spread freedom. He argued that slavery, not liberty, was the normal basis of civilization in world history, and argued that slaves were happy and contented. He suggested that white workers in the North and South should have paternal white owners to care for them rather than be enslaved by capitalist markets and employers. A plate manufactured in England to celebrate the emancipation of the British Empire. After a brief period of apprenticeship, all slaves were freed on August 1st, 1838. At the center, a family of former slaves celebrates outside their cabin. Our next focus question: what were the legal and material constraints on slaves' lives and work? For slaves, slavery meant incessant toil, harsh punishment, and constant fear that their families would be destroyed by sale. Slaves were the legal property of their owners. Their few legal rights were rarely enforced. Slaves could be bought and sold by their owners at will and had no voice in the governments that ruled over them. They could not testify in court against whites, sign contract or buy property, own firearms, hold meetings apart from whites, or leave the farm or plantation without permission. By the 1830s, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. Although these laws were not always enforced, the entire Southern legal and governmental system was designed to enforce slave masters' controls over slaves' bodies and their labor. During the 19th century, some Southern states passed laws to prevent slave mistreatment, and their material conditions did improve. Many slaves supplemented the food their owners provided by raising crops and livestock, gathering and hunting. They had better diets than slaves in the West Indies and Brazil. Paternalism contributed to slaves' material improvements over time, and the increasing price of slaves encouraged planters to care for their slaves' basic well-being. These improved conditions, however, were hardly intended to weaken slavery, but rather to strengthen it through the protection of economic investments. Yet slavery was tightened in the period, and states passed laws making it harder for owners to free their slaves and for slaves to buy their own freedom. This poster is advertising the raffle of a horse and a slave, treated as equivalents at a Missouri store. Metal shackles from around 1850. Slaves were shackled as a form of punishment or to prevent escape when being transported from one place to another. A face from the past. This is a female slave drying cotton on a plantation in South Carolina's Sea Islands during 1862. Men, women, and children all worked in the cotton fields side by side. This is slaves outside their cabin, also on a South Carolina plantation, probably photographed in the 1850s. They brought their furniture outdoors to be included in the photo. Slavery helped define the status of free blacks. By the Civil War, 500,000 free blacks lived in the United States, the majority of which were in the South. While whites defined their freedom by their distance from slavery, free blacks were not radically different than enslaved blacks. In most of the North, free blacks could not vote and had few economic opportunities. In the South, free blacks could not own their own property, could marry, and could not be bought or sold as slaves, but they had virtually no other rights in Southern society. They couldn't even own dogs, guns, or liquor, couldn't strike whites, even in self-defense, and they had to carry proof of their free status at all times. In other American slave societies where racial identity was less sharply distinguished, free blacks amassed property and prestige. In the United States, the sharp racial distinction between black and white left little room for a mulatto class to emerge. By 1860, very few of the South's free blacks lived in the lower South, and those who did were mostly in cities. In New Orleans and Charleston, however, free black communities existed, and while most were craftsmen, a few became quite wealthy. They established their own churches and schools. In the Upper South, where most Southern free blacks lived, they worked mostly for wages as farm labor. Some free blacks even owned their own slaves. This table shows the free black population in 1860 divided up by region and by state. The nation's population in 1860 included nearly 500,000 free blacks. The majority lived in the slave states, especially Maryland and Virginia. Slavery was above all a labor system in which work occupied the entirety of slaves' lives, except for brief meals. On large plantations, slaves performed all kinds of work, from labor in the fields to skilled labor like carpentry, engineering, and shoemaking. Slaves also worked on steamboats, in mines, in seaports, and on railroads. Local authorities used them to build roads and other facilities, and the federal government used them to build forts and other public buildings. Professionals such as merchants, lawyers, and businessmen used slaves, and by the Civil War, 200,000 slaves worked in industries such as ironworks and tobacco factories. In southern cities, slaves were used as unskilled labor and skilled artisans. A few slaves were entrusted with great responsibilities, such as supervising other slaves, selling goods, or handling money. Most slaves, perhaps as many as 75% of women and 90% of men, worked in the fields. The organization of their work varied according to crop size and the size of the holding. On small farms, slaves worked right alongside their owners. The largest concentration of slaves worked on plantations in the Cotton Belt in gangs, directed by an overseer and maybe a slave driver. Overseers, tasked with producing large crops, were often brutal. Slaves who worked on sugarcane in southern Louisiana also worked in gangs in the harshest working conditions in the South. Slaves who worked on rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia engaged in task labor without supervision and had free time for the day if they finished their daily tasks. Another drawing from Montgomery County, Texas, depicts blacks and whites laboring side by side. Here they're fashioning shingles for a roof from a felled tree. Cotton was the major agricultural product of the South, and indeed the nation, but slaves also grew rice, sugarcane, tobacco, and hemp. In this undated photograph, men, women, and children pick cotton under the watchful eye of an overseer. Unlike sugarcane, cotton does not grow to a great height, allowing an overseer to supervise a large number of slaves. Detail from Rice Culture on the Ogeechee. Published in 1867 in Harper's Weekly, this illustration illustrates work on a rice plantation divided into a checkerboard pattern by irrigation ditches. Although a white person is present, most of the slaves in the rice fields worked under the task system without daily oversight. From the slave's perspective, slavery in different regions of the South could be worse in some respects and better in others. Slaves in rice fields faced harsh conditions but had a lot more independence than other slaves because of the task labor and the absence of a large white population. Skilled urban slaves craftsmen had great autonomy and often could hire themselves out and sometimes even keep their earnings. Many urban slaves even lived by themselves. By the 1850s, most slave owners began to remove urban slaves to the country, fearing that their independence was eroding their relationship between master and slave. Slavery was based on force. Slave owners used a variety of methods to maintain order and discipline and persuade slaves to work productively. Masters could inflict almost any kind of punishment, and it was the rare slave who was not whipped at some point in his or her life. Even minor infractions invited whipping. Owners used subtler methods too. They exploited divisions among the slaves, especially between the field hands and the house servants. They created incentives for hard work, such as time off or cash payments. The threat of sale, however, was the most powerful weapon the owners had, since sale disrupted families and slave communities. But speaking of punishments, and this is very difficult to look at, but this is a public whipping of slaves in Lexington, Missouri in 1856, an illustration from the abolitionist publication, The Suppressed Book About Slavery. Whipping was a common form of punishment for slaves. Normally it was done one at a time. However, this illustration is from an abolitionist publication, so it shows kind of the bias that goes both ways. Not that slave whipping wasn't horrible, but it usually wasn't en masse. Usually, it did happen. And this is a kitchen ball at White Sulphur Springs, Virginia, an 1838 painting by German-born American artist Christian Mayer. Fashionably dressed domestic slaves celebrate the wedding of a couple who are dressed in white at the center. Our next focus question: how did family, gender, religion, and values combine to create the distinct slave cultures in the Old South? Slaves never gave up their hope for freedom or their will to resist total white control over them. They succeeded in creating a semi-independent culture centered on the family and the church, which enabled them to survive the experience of bondage without abandoning their self-esteem and to pass on to other generations values that conflicted with those of their masters. Slave culture drew on the heritage of Africa. African influence appeared in dance and music, forms of religious worship, and slave medicine. The end of the foreign slave trade helped foster a particularly new African American culture shaped by American and African traditions and values. The family was also the center of the slave community. Because of a natural increase of the slave population, in the United States there was an equal ratio of male to female slaves, which allowed for the creation of families. While the slave marriages were not legally recognized, masters had to consent to them, and there were often significant events on the plantations. Most slaves stayed married for life, if not disrupted by sale, and families typically had two parents, although the sale of male slaves created a higher number of female headed families than in white families. The threat of being sold, thus disrupting families, was the slaveholder's greatest weapon, and fear of being sold pervaded slave life. Many men and children were separated from families by sale, but so were women. Some masters simply ignored slave families when making decisions about selling slaves. Furthermore, slave traders gave little attention to preserving family ties. This 1842 engraving depicts an estate sale in New Orleans. At the center, a family of slaves is being sold. On the extreme right and left, auctioneers are selling other property, including paintings. And this is a broadside advertising the public sale of slaves along with horses, mule, and cattle after the death of the owner. I want you to pause the video here and really take a minute and study this broadside. The advertisement notes that slaves will be sold individually or in groups as best suits the purchaser, which is an indication that the families are likely to be broken up, and there are several children listed in here, as well as several much older men and women. The prices are based on each slave's sex, age, and skill, and look at how they compare to the price of cows, mules, and livestock. In some ways, gender roles for slaves were very different from those in larger society. Slave men and women were equally powerless. The cult of domesticity, relegating women to the home, did not apply to slave women. Slave men could not provide for their families, protect wives from physical or sexual abuse by their owners or overseers, or choose when and how their children might work. However, when slaves worked on their own time, traditional gender roles prevailed. Slave men worked outdoors, while slave women cared for children and cooked. The slave family remained central to slave culture and allowed slaves to transmit their value and traditions and strategies for survival from generation to generation. A distinctive form of Christianity also helped slaves survive and resist bondage. Slaves participated in the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. Every plantation seemed to have a slave preacher, often with little education but considerable oratorical skill and knowledge of the Bible. Urban slaves often established their own churches, but masters used Christianity as another means of control and discipline. Some required their slaves to attend sermons reminding slaves that theft was immoral and that servants should obey their masters. Slaves transformed the Christianity that they had embraced, turning it to their own purposes. Blending African and American beliefs, slave religion was practiced clandestinely on plantations. The biblical story of Exodus, in which God chose Moses to lead the Jews out of Egypt to the Promised Land, played a central role in Black Christianity. Slaves identified themselves as a chosen people who would be delivered from bondage in time, while Jesus stood as a personal redeemer who cared for the oppressed. Other figures from the Bible that overcame oppression were important to slave religion, and the Christian message of brotherhood and equality of all people before the Creator irrefutably indicted slavery in the eyes of the enslaved. This was originally painted on the back panel of a formal portrait, but it illustrates two luxuries of a Virginia slave owner: the power to sexually abuse women and to whip slaves. This is a Negro church on the Rockville Plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, in an 1863 photograph. Few plantations had such a building. Most slaves worshiped secretly or in biracial churches with white ministers. And this is a plantation burial, a painting from around 1860 by John Antrobus, an English artist who immigrated to New Orleans in 1850 and later married the daughter of a plantation owner. A Black slave preacher conducts a funeral service while Black men, women, and children look on. This is a rare eyewitness depiction of Black culture under slavery. Slave culture rested on slaves' beliefs that slavery was unjust and their yearning for freedom. Despite pro-slavery arguments, slaves understood that they were being deprived of the fruits of their labor by idle planters living lives of luxury. While most slaves knew that it was impossible to directly combat their condition, this did not prevent them from desiring freedom. Furthermore, many slaves acquiring knowledge of the outside world, both local and national, despite owners' attempts to prevent them from doing so. Slaves constantly talked and dreamed of liberty, and their actions during and after the Civil War flowed from their experience of slavery and their hope of escaping it. Our next focus question: what were the major forms of resistance to slavery? Outnumbered by whites and facing federal, state, and local authorities dedicated to preserving slavery, slaves only rarely rebelled. Compared to Caribbean or Latin American slavery, where slaves were more numerous and more often imported directly from Africa, slave rebellions in the United States were smaller and far less frequent. This does not mean that slaves simply submitted to their condition, however. Resistance to slavery took many forms, from individual acts of disobedience to the occasional uprising. The most common form of slave opposition was day-to-day resistance or silent sabotage. This is where they would do poor work, break tools, abuse animals, and simply disrupt the plantation routine. Slaves faked illness or found other ways to avoid reporting to work. Many slaves stole food, but less frequent and more dangerous were assaults against whites, from arson and poison to armed attacks. Escape was a serious threat to slavery's stability. Most slaves who ran away would leave the plantation for a day or two simply to frustrate their owners, but they would later return. The smaller number of fugitive slaves who attempted to permanently escape faced considerable obstacles to freedom. They had little to no knowledge of geography beyond the plantation, other than to know that the North meant freedom. Perhaps 1,000 slaves reached the North or Canada each year. Most fugitive slaves escaped from Upper South states where they could more easily reach the North. In the Deep South, fugitive slaves often went to cities where they could blend in with free Black communities. A loose organization of sympathetic Black and white abolitionists called the Underground Railroad helped slaves run away. A few courageous individuals, such as Harriet Tubman, made forays into the South to liberate slaves and guide them to freedom. Most slaves who managed to escape, however, did so of their own initiative, often showing remarkable ingenuity. Rather than a rigid system, the Underground Railroad was a series of interlocking local networks involving Black and white abolitionists. These networks communicated with one another and assisted a substantial number of fugitives, estimated at about 30,000 in the 3 decades before the Civil War, to escape to the North and Canada. While the numbers were not enough to undermine the entire system of slavery, the Underground Railroad and escapes became a major source of consternation in the slave states. By the 1850s, slaves were using numerous means of escape. Not simply fleeing on foot, but by boats run by sympathetic crews, taking owners' horses and carriages and bombarding trains. Driven by multiple motives connected to freedom, their actions profoundly impacted national politics. Runaways undermined the Southern narrative of the contented slave, and fugitives became a major irritant in diplomatic affairs with other countries, such as Mexico and Canada, when they refused to return the escaped slaves. Efforts to recapture slaves escaped to the North, however, demonstrated that the peculiar institution extended its power into free states as well. Many Northerners who were not abolitionists were forced to confront the question of the relationship between individual conscience and obedience to laws requiring their cooperation in returning runaway slaves. This is the top part of a typical broadside offering a reward for the capture of 4 runaway slaves. This was distributed in Mississippi County, Missouri in 1852. The high reward for George, $1,000, suggests that he must be an extremely valuable worker. The instances of slave resistance occurred throughout the Western Hemisphere, on land and at sea. The map shows the location of major events in the 19th century. And this is Henry Brown. This is one of the most celebrated escapes of the antebellum years. Henry Brown was a slave in Richmond, and he had himself concealed in a crate and shipped to the anti-slavery office in Philadelphia. This lithograph from 1851 shows 3 white abolitionists, including J. Miller Mickham, with a hatchet, as well as African-American William Still, a leader of the Underground Railroad in the city, who holds the top of the crate as Brown emerges. In a few cases, large groups of rebellious slaves gained their freedom. The most famous case involves the slaves aboard the Amistad, a slave ship off the Cuban coast in 1839. After they seized the ship, the slaves sailed up the American coast until it was seized. While President Martin Van Buren wanted to return the slaves to Cuba, abolitionists helped the slaves sue for freedom, and in the Supreme Court, former President John Quincy Adams defended them. Adams argued that since the slaves had been brought from Africa in violation of international treaties banning the slave trade, they should be freed. The court agreed, and most of the freed slaves immigrated back to Africa. While the Amistad case had no legal bearing on slaves in the United States, it may have inspired later revolts on slave ships such as the Creole, which eventually found refuge in the British Bahamas. Slaves only rarely mounted organized rebellions within the United States. The four largest conspiracies in American history happened between 1800 and 1831. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 was followed in 1811 by an uprising on sugar plantations in Louisiana, in which several hundred armed slaves who tried to march on New Orleans were defeated in a bloody encounter with militia and federal troops. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a slave carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, organized a rebellion. He quoted the Bible in the Declaration of Independence to justify armed resistance. His plot was discovered before it was implemented, and Vesey and 34 other blacks were executed. Much of the evidence for slave conspiracies is contradictory and disputed because trials were conducted in secret, and the accused were forbidden from confronting those who testified against them. The best-known slave rebel, however, was Nat Turner, a slave preacher and mystic in Virginia who believed that God had appointed him to lead a black rebellion. Though he initially chose to launch his uprising on July 4, 1831, it was delayed until August when he led a handful of his followers from farm to farm, killing white families along the way. After killing dozens of whites, Turner and his followers were captured and executed. Nat Turner's rebellion shocked the South and caused owners throughout the region to punish and execute recalcitrant or suspect slaves. In the aftermath, Virginia's legislature passed harsh laws further restricting slaves and the rights of free blacks. Other southern states followed suit. The rebellion also inspired a growing movement of abolitionists in the North to demand the immediate abolition of slavery, sparking a reaction in the South against abolition and civil liberties that would intensify sectional hostility. In some ways, 1831 marked a turning point in the Old South. That year, the British Parliament launched a program for the abolition of slavery within the empire, which underscored the growing isolation of slavery in the South. William Lloyd Garrison, an ardent abolitionist, argued that slavery faced enemies from within and from outside the South. The pro-slavery argument seemed increasingly permeated Southern society, and abolitionists and their ideas were increasingly unwelcome, with some facing violence. As reform movements in the North more frequently and assertively condemned slavery, the South closed in defense of the institution. This is Cinque, a leader of the slave revolt on the Amistad, in an 1839 painting by Nathaniel Jocelyn, a prominent Connecticut artist. And this engraving depicts Nat Turner's slave rebellion of 1831 from a book published soon after the revolt. I hope you've enjoyed this week's lecture. Here's a review of the focus questions that we've gone over. Next week, we're going to be discussing the Age of Reform from 1820 and 1840, including the sectionalism that will fracture the nation and the original rise of feminism. As always, if you have any feedback or questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Have a great week.